Imagine living in a city where 2 million people somehow shared space smaller than Manhattan, where your upstairs neighbor's chamber pot might leak through your ceiling, and where the person selling you bread knew more about your personal life than your closest friends do today. Tonight, I want to tell you about Rome. Not the marble monuments you see in movies, but the Rome that smelled like charcoal smoke and human sweat, where ordinary people solved impossible problems with nothing but stubborn ingenuity and an unshakable belief that tomorrow's bread would somehow appear on schedule. Welcome, I'm the historian. I have walked through the dust of ages, and today I will tell you what I saw when the sun rose over 7 hills and the smell of bread mixed with charcoal smoke drifted through narrow streets that would make your alleyway look spacious. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy stories that make the ancient world feel as real as your own neighborhood. And let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Sometimes history is better than sleep, and other times it just makes you dream deeper. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum, and let's walk together through Rome when it wasn't ruins and tourists, but a living, breathing city where 2 million people somehow managed to coexist in a space smaller than modern Manhattan. I remember standing in a Roman street at dawn, and the first thing that hit me wasn't the sight, it was the sound. Not the romantic clatter of horse hooves on cobblestones you see in movies, but something more practical and honestly more annoying. The sound of 2 million people trying to get somewhere at the same time, in streets that were never designed for crowds. Picture this. You're living in Rome around 100 AD, during what historians politely call the height of the empire. What they don't tell you is that height came with a cost, and that cost was personal space. Rome had grown so fast that city planning had basically given up and gone home. Streets twisted like a drunk person's walk home, most barely wide enough for 2 people to pass without awkwardly brushing shoulders. The buildings, oh the buildings. Forget the marble temples you see in documentaries. Most Romans lived in what were essentially ancient apartment blocks called insulae. These were 5, 6, sometimes 7 stories tall, made of wood, brick, and hope. The higher you lived, the cheaper your rent and the more likely you were to die in a fire or collapse. The ground floor was for the wealthy, the top floor was for people who'd made questionable life choices or just had terrible luck. I watched families squeeze into single rooms that would make a modern studio apartment look luxurious. No running water above the ground floor, no heat except for small charcoal braziers that doubled as death traps, and walls so thin you could hear your neighbor's entire life story, whether you wanted to or not. But here's the thing that struck me most. These people weren't miserable. They were alive in a way that's hard to understand now. The street was their living room. The forum was their Facebook. The public baths were their social club, gym, and gossip central all rolled into one steamy, loud, wonderfully chaotic experience. Let me tell you about Marcus, that baker I mentioned. I knew him, in the way you know someone whose shop you pass every day for years. Marcus lived on the 2nd floor of an insula near the Subura district, which was basically Rome's version of the wrong side of the tracks. He woke every morning at what we'd call 3 a.m., not by choice, but because bread waits for no one, and Romans took their bread seriously. In the dark, he'd feel his way down narrow wooden stairs that creaked like old bones, past families still sleeping in their single rooms, past the ground floor shop that sold everything from oil lamps to questionable fish sauce. The street outside would already be stirring. Bakers weren't the only early risers in Rome. The city had a rhythm, you see. Before dawn, the streets belonged to the working class. Bakers, obviously, but also the people who cleaned the public. Latrines, emptied chamber pots, hauled water, and did all the unglamorous work that kept 2 million people from living in complete chaos. These were the people Rome depended on but rarely talked about. Marcus would unlock his small bakery, barely larger than a modern bedroom, and begin the process that would feed his corner of the empire. Roman bread wasn't the fluffy white stuff. you'd recognize. It was dense, dark, sometimes gritty with bits of stone from the grinding process. But it was life itself. Rome imported grain from Egypt, from Africa, from wherever they could find it. Because a hungry Rome was a dangerous Rome. The ovens were communal affairs, huge brick constructions that served multiple bakers. You'd prepare your dough, Mark. It's somehow so you'd recognize it later, then carry it through streets that were starting to wake up, past early shoppers, and people heading to work. The oven keeper would arrange everyone's bread inside these massive ovens that stayed hot from the previous day's baking. While waiting for the bread, Marcus would join other bakers, chatting in the pre-dawn darkness about prices, about politics, about whose bread had turned out particularly good or particularly terrible the day before. These men, and they were mostly men in this trade, formed a sort of unofficial brotherhood. They shared techniques, complained about customers, and probably gossiped more effectively than any modern social network. As the sun started to rise, the character of the streets changed completely. The working class early shift was joined by everyone else. Slaves carrying water jugs, merchants setting up their stalls, citizens heading to the forum for business or politics, children running errands, and the general magnificent chaos of urban life. Traffic was already a problem in Rome. Julius Caesar had actually banned wheeled vehicles from the city center during daylight hours, except for construction materials and a few exceptions. This meant all the supply carts, all the goods that kept the city running, had to move at night. So Romans went to sleep to the sound of wooden wheels on stone, ox carts groaning under loads of grain or wine or olive oil, and drivers cursing. In half a dozen languages. During the day, if you needed to transport something heavy, you used slaves or donkeys. If you were wealthy enough to own a litter, you could have yourself carried by slaves, which was the Roman equivalent of an Uber that never got stuck in traffic but required you to own other human beings. The moral complexity of this wasn't lost on everyone, even then, but it was so woven into the fabric of society that alternatives seemed impossible. The noise was incredible. 2 million people talking, arguing, buying, selling, working, laughing, crying, all in a space without any sound-dampening technology. Stone and brick everywhere, which meant every sound echoed and bounced and multiplied. Merchants calling out their wares, children playing games that sounded suspiciously like the same games kids play now, animals making animal noises, construction, work that never seemed to stop, and the smells. Oh, the smells were a constantly changing symphony of human civilization. Fresh bread mixing with charcoal smoke, olive oil heating in countless small restaurants, the sharp tang of wine and vinegar, the earthy smell of animals, the not-so-pleasant odors of human waste, and underneath it all, the scent of incense from hundreds of small household shrines and temples. Romans were constantly burning incense, not just for religious reasons, but because it helped mask some of the less pleasant aspects of urban living. Every home had its household gods. Every neighborhood had its local shrines, and walking through the city meant walking through clouds of frankincense, myrrh, and other scents that spoke of trade routes stretching to India and beyond. The streets themselves were engineering marvels that were also daily obstacles. Roman roads were famous for being straight and well-built, but that was between cities. Inside Rome, you had centuries of organic growth, buildings built on top of older buildings, streets that followed property lines and ancient paths rather than any sensible plan. Most streets were barely wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably. When a donkey loaded with amphorae of wine encountered a group of citizens heading to the baths, someone had to back up, squeeze against a building, or duck into a shop doorway. This happened hundreds of times a day, and somehow people managed it with relatively good humor. The really wealthy had a solution to street-level chaos. They lived in domus, single-family homes built around courtyards, with high walls that blocked out most of the noise and smell. But even the wealthy had to venture into the streets for business, politics, or social obligations. There was no escaping the fundamental reality of Roman urban life. You shared space with everyone. I remember watching a senator, dressed in his white toga with the purple stripe that marked his rank, navigating the same narrow streets as slaves, carrying chamber pots. Democracy might have been complicated in Rome, but the streets were remarkably egalitarian. Everyone breathed the same smoky air. Everyone dodged the same donkeys. Everyone had to wait their turn at the same narrow passages. Children fascinated me most. Roman children, especially the poor ones, treated the entire city as their playground. They played in the forums, splashed in public fountains when no one was looking, ran messages between shops, and generally seemed to know every secret passage and shortcut in their neighborhood. They were small, quick, and could navigate the urban maze better than adults who'd lived there for decades. The games they played were surprisingly familiar. They had a version of hopscotch. They played with small clay marbles. They had dolls and toy soldiers and spinning tops. But they also played games that reflected their environment. I watched children pretend to be gladiators, staging elaborate mock battles with wooden swords. I saw them play senators and citizens, complete with dramatic speeches that were probably more entertaining than the real thing. By mid-morning, Marcus would have retrieved his bread from the communal ovens and returned to his shop. The morning rush was about to begin, and Romans were particular about their bread. They knew their baker, they had opinions about crust thickness and crumb density, and they weren't shy about expressing those opinions. The social aspects of buying bread were as important as the transaction itself. This was where you learned neighborhood news, where you found out who was getting married, who had died, what the latest political rumors were, and whether anyone had seen unusual activity that might suggest the authorities were planning something. Information flowed through these daily interactions like water through an aqueduct system. And speaking of aqueducts, the water system was one of Rome's genuine marvels. Clean water flowed into the city from sources dozens of miles away, through channels and pipes that were maintained by teams of specialized workers. But here's what movies don't show you. Most people didn't have running water in their homes. You went to public fountains with containers, you filled them up, and you carried water home. This created another layer of daily social interaction. The fountain was where you met your neighbors, where children played while parents filled their jugs, where you might encounter someone from a completely different social class who happened to live in your neighborhood. Water was free, but it required time and effort and became part of the social fabric of daily life. The morning crowd was a living demonstration of how an empire worked. In those streets, you might hear Latin, Greek, Germanic languages, various Celtic dialects, and languages from Africa and Asia. Rome had become a magnet that drew people from everywhere, either as slaves, as merchants, as soldiers completing their service, or as free citizens seeking opportunity. This diversity created constant low-level cultural exchange. Foods, ideas, religious practices, and technologies mixed and evolved. The Roman Empire wasn't just a political entity. It was a vast experiment in multiculturalism, conducted mostly at street level by ordinary people trying to live their lives. But it also created tensions. Different groups lived in different neighborhoods, followed different customs, worshipped different gods. Sometimes this led to conflicts that required intervention from authorities. Sometimes it led to beautiful hybrid cultures that combined traditions in ways that wouldn't have been possible anywhere else. As morning turned toward midday, the character of the crowd changed again. The early workers had mostly finished their morning tasks. The business class was emerging for the day's serious work. Politicians were heading toward the forums for speeches and meetings. And the afternoon crowd was beginning to gather energy for the next phase of Roman daily life. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The morning crowd was special because it represented hope, the beginning of another day in the most complex city the world had ever known. Every person hurrying through those narrow streets carried dreams, worries, plans, and connections that tied them to family, friends, work, and the broader empire that stretched from Britain to North Africa. Marcus, closing his shop for the midday break when the heat made baking impossible, would head home for a meal and rest. But in a few hours, he'd be back, preparing for the evening baking that would feed his neighbors tomorrow morning. The cycle continued, day after day, season after season, year after year. The morning crowd dispersed, but it never really disappeared. It transformed, evolved, became the afternoon crowd, then the evening crowd, then the night crowd of delivery carts and people who worked in darkness. Rome never slept, not really. It just changed its rhythm, like a heartbeat that adjusted to match the needs of 2 million human lives, somehow finding a way to coexist in one impossible, magnificent, chaotic city. The afternoon in Rome belonged to the baths, and if you wanted to understand how an empire really worked, you needed to watch what happened when Romans took their clothes off. I spent countless afternoons in Roman bathhouses, not because I particularly enjoyed the experience, mind you, but because this was where the real business of the empire got conducted. Forget the Senate, forget the forums filled with formal speeches. The baths were where deals were made, alliances formed, gossip exchanged, and the actual machinery of Roman society hummed along in clouds of steam and the splash of heated water. Let me paint you a picture of what it was like to enter the baths of Caracalla on a typical afternoon. First, the scale. These weren't intimate little spas. The baths of Caracalla could accommodate 1,600 bathers at once. The building covered 25 acres. It had hot rooms, cold rooms, warm rooms, swimming pools, exercise areas, libraries, shops, restaurants, and spaces whose purposes I'm still not entirely sure about. The noise hit you first. 1,600 people talking, laughing, splashing, exercising, arguing, conducting business, and generally living their lives at full volume. Roman baths weren't quiet, contemplative spaces. They were more like a community center, gym, business district, and social club all mashed together in one magnificently loud, steamy environment. Then came the smells. Olive oil, because Romans used oil instead of soap. Sweat, obviously. The sulfur scent of heated mineral water. Perfumes and unguents that wealthy Romans slathered on themselves. Food cooking in the attached restaurants. Incense from small shrines scattered throughout the complex. And underneath it all, the distinct smell of humanity in large numbers, which was not always pleasant but was undeniably alive. The social dynamics fascinated me most. Roman society was incredibly hierarchical. Senators at the top, then equites, wealthy businessmen, then regular citizens, then freed slaves, then slaves. These distinctions mattered enormously in most contexts. But in the baths, naked in pools of hot water, hierarchies got complicated. Oh, they didn't disappear entirely. Wealthy Romans brought slaves to carry their oil flasks, to scrape them, clean with strigils, curved metal scrapers that did the work of soap, to hold their clothes and generally serve their needs. The very wealthy sometimes even brought their own portable seats and tables, creating little islands of luxury in the communal space. But money couldn't buy you a private bath experience. The senator's naked body looked remarkably similar to the freedman's naked body when both were submerged in the same pool of hot water. Conversations that would have been impossible in the formal social world became natural in the baths. A skilled craftsman might find himself discussing techniques with a patrician who shared his interest in building or metalwork. The bathing process itself was a ritual that said everything about Roman attitudes toward the body, cleanliness, and social interaction. You didn't just jump in and splash around. There was an order, a system, a proper way to do things that had been refined over centuries. You started in the apoditerium, the changing room, where you removed your clothes, and hopefully left them with a slave or attendant you trusted. Theft was common in the baths, and Romans developed elaborate strategies for protecting their belongings while bathing. Some hired guards, some brought trusted slaves, some simply wore their oldest clothes and accepted that they might go home naked. From there, you might begin with exercise in the palestra, the exercise area. Romans believed that working up a sweat was an important part of the cleansing process. They had weights, they wrestled, they played various ball games, they ran around tracks. The idea was to open your pores, get your blood flowing, and prepare your body for the serious business of bathing. Next came the succession of heated rooms. The tepidarium was warm, the caldarium was hot, and the sudatorium was basically a sauna that would make modern spa-goers weep. Romans believed that sweating out impurities was essential to health, and they took this belief to extremes that would challenge even the most dedicated modern fitness enthusiast. In the caldarium, the hottest room, you'd sweat profusely while slaves scraped your skin with strigils, removing dead skin, oil, and whatever else had accumulated since your last visit. This wasn't a gentle process. Romans believed that vigorous scraping was necessary for proper cleanliness, and they weren't wrong. Without soap, the combination of oil and scraping was actually quite effective at removing dirt and dead skin. The social aspects of this process were remarkable. Imagine conducting a business negotiation while someone scrapes oil and dead skin from your back. Imagine discussing politics while sweat pours down your face and steam makes it difficult to see clearly. Somehow, the Romans managed it. They conducted serious conversations under conditions that would make modern boardroom meetings seem formal and restrained. The hot rooms led to the cold plunge, the frigidarium, where you'd shock your system by jumping into cold water. Romans believed this was essential for closing pores and improving circulation. The sudden temperature change was supposed to be invigorating, and judging by the reactions I witnessed, it certainly was something. But here's what made the Roman baths special: the mixing. Rich and poor, citizen and freedman, local Roman and visitor from distant provinces, all sharing the same water, the same steam, the same fundamental human experience of trying to get clean in a social environment. I watched a merchant from Gaul explain his trade routes to a Roman senator who was considering investing in his business. I saw a retired centurion teaching sword techniques to young men whose fathers had never served in the military. I observed philosophers from Greece debating with practical Roman engineers about the nature of knowledge and the proper way to build a bridge. These weren't formal educational settings. They were casual conversations that happened because people were relaxed, literally and figuratively. The heat, the steam, the shared vulnerability of nakedness created a social environment where barriers came down and real human connections became possible. The baths also served as informal news centers. This was where you learned what was happening in distant provinces, what new laws were being considered, which senators were feuding with each other, and what the emperor was actually doing as opposed to what official sources claimed he was doing. Information flowed through the baths like water through the hypocaust heating system. A trader just back from Britain would share news of rebellion or peace in the northern provinces. A government official might let slip details about tax policy or military deployments. A soldier on leave would describe conditions on the German frontier or the situation in Egypt. But the baths were also places of surprising intimacy. Romans were comfortable with their bodies in ways that might seem shocking to later, more modest cultures. Men and women bathed separately, but within those separate spaces, physical contact was normal and expected. Friends would oil each other's backs, scrape each other clean, help with massage, and generally treat the human body as something natural rather than shameful. This comfort with physicality extended to conversation topics. Romans discussed their health, their sexual lives, their bodily functions, and their physical needs with a frankness that was both refreshing and occasionally overwhelming. The baths were places where pretense was difficult to maintain, when everyone could see exactly what your body looked like and how it functioned. The massage areas were particularly interesting social spaces. Professional masseurs, often slaves, trained in techniques learned from Greek traditions, would work on Romans of all social classes. But it was also common for friends to massage each other, creating moments of physical intimacy that were accepted as normal parts of friendship. I watched Roman men discuss philosophy while having their muscles worked on by skilled hands. I saw business partnerships formed over shared massage experiences. The combination of physical relaxation and mental stimulation seemed to create ideal conditions for both serious thought and practical problem solving. The libraries attached to major bathhouses added another layer to the experience. Romans could combine physical cleansing with intellectual stimulation. Scholars would read scrolls while soaking in warm pools. Students would discuss their lessons while getting scraped clean. The integration of body and mind that characterized Roman bath culture reflected a holistic approach to human well-being that was remarkably sophisticated. Food was everywhere in the baths. Vendors sold everything from simple snacks to elaborate meals. Romans might spend entire afternoons in the baths, so they needed sustenance. But eating while bathing created its own social dynamics. Sharing food was a way of building relationships, demonstrating generosity, and showing respect for social hierarchies. I remember watching a wealthy patron buy wine and bread for everyone in his section of the baths, a gesture that instantly elevated his social status and created obligations and connections that might be useful in future business or political dealings. The economics of bath culture were complex, with layers of gift-giving, reciprocity, and status display that operated simultaneously with the more basic function of getting clean. The architecture of the baths reflected Roman engineering genius, but it also shaped social behavior in subtle ways. The design encouraged movement, circulation, and encounter. You couldn't simply sit in one spot and ignore everyone else. The bathing sequence required you to move through different spaces, and each transition created opportunities for conversation, observation, and connection. The hypocaust heating system was a marvel that kept the floors warm and the air comfortable, even in winter. But it also created a shared experience of luxury that was available to almost anyone who could afford the small admission fee. This democratization of comfort was one of Rome's most remarkable achievements. The poorest citizen could experience heated floors and hot running water, luxuries that would have been unimaginable to most people in the ancient world. Slaves had complicated relationships with bath culture. They served wealthy Romans, but they also had their own bathing times and spaces. Some baths had separate hours for slaves. Others had designated areas. The best slaves, particularly those with valuable skills, might even bathe alongside their masters in certain contexts. The social boundaries that seemed so rigid in other settings became more fluid in the unique environment of the baths. Children fascinated me in the baths. Roman children learned social skills, observed adult behavior, and absorbed cultural values simply by participating in bath culture from an early age. They saw how negotiations worked, how relationships formed, how conflicts resolved, and how society organized itself. The baths were informal schools for citizenship and social competence. The evening hours in the baths had their own character. As the afternoon business crowd gave way to people seeking relaxation after work, conversations became more personal, more philosophical, more reflective. Romans would discuss their dreams, their fears, their hopes for their children, their thoughts about mortality and the meaning of life. I listened to conversations about the nature of the soul, the proper way to live, the relationship between individual desires and social obligations, and the question of what, if anything, might survive death. These weren't abstract philosophical discussions conducted by professional intellectuals. They were practical people wrestling with fundamental human questions while soaking in hot water at the end of a long day. The baths closed at sunset, not because Romans were prudish about bathing in darkness, but because the heating systems were expensive to maintain, and most people needed to prepare for the evening's activities. But the conversations continued. Friendships formed in the baths extended into dinner invitations, business partnerships, political alliances, and the countless other connections that held Roman society together. As I watched Romans emerge from the baths, clean and relaxed and socially recharged, I realized I was witnessing something remarkable. Here was a civilization that had figured out how to combine individual self-care with community building, personal hygiene with social networking, physical wellness with intellectual stimulation, and private needs with public benefits. The Roman baths weren't just places to get clean. They were engines of social cohesion, spaces where the empire's diverse populations learned to coexist, and laboratories for developing the complex social skills necessary to hold together a vast multicultural political entity. They were, in their own steamy, noisy, wonderfully chaotic way, one of Rome's greatest achievements. When the sun set over Rome, most decent citizens hurried home, barred their doors, and tried to ignore what happened in the darkness. But I was curious about shadows, so I stayed out and discovered that nighttime Rome was almost a different city. Entirely, with its own inhabitants, its own economy, and its own rules that had very little to do with the orderly daytime empire. The transition from day to night Rome happened gradually, then all at once. As afternoon became evening, the respectable crowds began to thin. Senators headed home to their domus for elaborate dinners. Merchants packed up their stalls and secured their goods. Families retreated to their island for whatever passed as domestic life in cramped quarters. The forum, so busy during the day, began to empty except for the occasional late business meeting or political gathering that couldn't wait until tomorrow. But just as the day crowd disappeared, the night people began to emerge. These weren't necessarily criminals, though plenty of those existed too. These were Romans whose work happened in darkness, whose needs couldn't wait for dawn, and whose social lives operated outside conventional schedules. Remember, wheeled vehicles were banned from Rome's center during daylight hours, so everything that kept the city supplied had to move at night. As evening fell, the streets filled with ox carts, mule trains, and human porters carrying everything the city needed to function. Grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Spain, manufactured goods from workshops throughout the empire, all moving through narrow streets in a carefully choreographed dance of logistics that would impress modern supply chain managers. The drivers of these carts were a breed apart. They knew every street, every shortcut, every spot where a loaded cart might get stuck or cause problems. They had their own language, their own social networks, and their own informal rules about who had right-of-way when two heavily loaded ox carts met in a street barely wide enough for one. I followed these supply convoys and discovered an entire economic ecosystem that operated in darkness. Warehouse workers who unloaded goods by torchlight, dock workers at the Tiber River ports who worked through the night, stable keepers who cared for the animals that powered Rome's supply system, guards who protected valuable cargo from theft, an army of people whose labor made daytime Rome possible, but who were largely invisible to the respectable citizens who benefited from their work. The night markets proper began to open around the time most Romans were finishing their evening meals. These weren't the grand, official markets of the Forum. These were smaller, more specialized, and often more interesting enterprises that catered to needs that couldn't wait until morning or that served customers who preferred to shop in darkness. Food vendors were everywhere. Romans who worked night shifts needed to eat, and night food had its own character. Street vendors sold everything from simple bread and cheese to elaborate stews that had been cooking all day. The smell of roasting meat, frying vegetables, and mulled wine mixed with the smoke from countless small fires and created an atmosphere that was part celebration, part necessity, and part mild danger. But the night markets weren't just about practical needs. They were also about pleasures that daylight society frowned upon or regulated heavily. Wine shops that stayed open late catered to customers who wanted to drink without the social oversight that came with daylight establishments. Gambling dens operated more openly in darkness. Prostitutes, both male and female, conducted business. That was legal but socially complicated. The sexual commerce of nighttime Rome was fascinating and complex. Prostitution was legal and regulated, but it carried social stigma that varied depending on your class, your role, and your reasons. Wealthy Romans might visit high-class establishments that offered entertainment, conversation, and sexual services. In elegant surroundings, poorer Romans had access to cheaper options that were more straightforward about their purpose. But the night markets also served needs that had nothing to do with vice. Apothecaries stayed open late because illness didn't wait for business hours. Midwives could be summoned at any time because babies arrived on their own schedule. Priests and priestesses of various cults offered religious services for people whose spiritual needs couldn't wait until the next festival day. I spent many evenings in taverns that catered to the night crowd, and these were very different from the respectable establishments that served meals to daytime customers. Night taverns were darker, louder, and more relaxed about social conventions. Romans who wouldn't normally speak to each other found themselves sharing tables and conversation over wine and simple food. These taverns served as informal employment centers where people looking for work could find temporary jobs loading carts, moving goods, or helping with other night labor. They were social clubs where night workers could relax with others who shared their unusual schedules. They were information exchanges where news traveled through networks that operated parallel to daytime society. The entertainment in night taverns was rougher and more direct than what you'd find in respectable daytime venues. Musicians played popular songs rather than refined classical pieces. Dancers performed with more enthusiasm and less clothing. Storytellers told bawdy tales that would have scandalized proper Roman matrons but delighted audiences who worked hard. Physical jobs and wanted straightforward entertainment. Gambling was everywhere in the night markets, and Romans were enthusiastic gamblers who would bet on almost anything. Dice games were popular, but Romans also wagered on chariot races, gladiator matches, political outcomes, the weather, and probably whether the next person to walk through the door would be wearing a red cloak. The gambling created its own social dynamics, with winners buying drinks for the table and losers hoping to recoup their losses with increasingly desperate bets. But perhaps the most interesting aspect of the night markets was how they served Rome's diverse population. During the day, social hierarchies and cultural differences were carefully managed through elaborate systems of etiquette, law, and custom. At night, those barriers became more permeable. I watched Roman citizens sharing wine with Greek philosophers, Germanic freedmen teaching drinking songs to Egyptian merchants, and Jewish traders explaining their dietary laws to curious locals who had never thought about why someone might refuse pork. The night markets were spaces where cultural exchange happened naturally, informally, and without the oversight of authorities who might have concerns about proper behavior. Religious diversity was particularly visible at night. Rome officially tolerated many different cults and belief systems, but daytime religious practice was often constrained by social expectations and political considerations. At night, people could worship according to their own traditions with less concern about how their neighbors might react. I observed mystery religions that conducted their ceremonies in darkness, not because they were secretive or dangerous, but because darkness enhanced the spiritual experience. I saw followers of various Eastern gods performing rituals that combined religious devotion with community celebration. I watched Romans exploring spiritual practices that came from every corner of the empire, seeking meaning and connection in ways that went far beyond official state religion. The night markets also served practical needs that daylight commerce couldn't meet. Sailors whose ships arrived at odd hours needed supplies immediately. Travelers who reached Rome after dark needed food, lodging, and information about the city. Workers whose shifts ended late needed services that weren't available during regular business hours. Blacksmiths worked through the night to meet urgent orders. Bakers began their work in darkness to have fresh bread ready for dawn. Fullers, who cleaned clothing using techniques that were both effective and incredibly smelly, often worked at night to avoid offending daytime customers with their odors. The night economy was essential to keeping Rome functioning smoothly, but the night markets had dangers that everyone understood and tried to navigate carefully. Crime was more common in darkness. Robbery, assault, and various forms of fraud increased when visibility was poor and fewer people were around to witness or prevent problems. Romans who ventured out at night carried minimal valuables, traveled in groups when possible, and stayed alert to their surroundings. The City Watch, Rome's equivalent of police, focused their efforts on the night hours. But with 2 million people and a relatively small force of watchmen, they couldn't be everywhere. Romans developed their own strategies for staying safe, including hiring guards, learning self-defense, and cultivating relationships with night workers who could provide protection or assistance if needed. Fire was a constant concern in nighttime Rome. All those torches, oil lamps, and small fires used for cooking and heating created multiple opportunities for disaster in a city built largely of wood and other flammable materials. The night markets included firefighting equipment and people trained to respond quickly to outbreaks, but major fires were always possible and could destroy entire neighborhoods in a matter of hours. The social dynamics of night markets reflected Rome's complex attitudes toward pleasure, work, and social order. Romans weren't puritanical, but they also weren't libertines. They had detailed opinions about what constituted appropriate behavior, and these opinions varied depending on your social class, your age, your gender, and your role in society. The night markets provided spaces where these rules could be relaxed without being completely abandoned. I watched young Roman men sowing wild oats in ways their families would have found mortifying, but which were considered normal parts of growing up. I saw married women meeting female friends for wine and conversation in settings that would have been inappropriate during the day, but were acceptable in the more relaxed atmosphere of evening entertainment. The night markets were also spaces where people could experiment with different aspects of their identity. A respectable daytime merchant might spend evenings as an amateur poet, sharing verses with other aspiring writers. A serious government clerk might reveal unexpected talents as a musician or storyteller. The darkness provided cover for exploring parts of yourself that didn't fit conventional social roles. Seasonal variations affected the night markets significantly. Summer nights were warm and comfortable, encouraging people to stay out late and socialize outdoors. Winter nights were cold and dangerous, reducing the nighttime population to those who had essential business in the darkness. Spring and fall offered pleasant temperatures, but unpredictable weather that could change the character of an evening in minutes. Religious festivals created special nighttime activities that brought different crowds to the markets. Some celebrations lasted all night, with religious observances giving way to secular party activities that continued until dawn. Romans used these occasions to purchase special foods, decorative items, and festive clothing that wasn't available during ordinary shopping hours. The end of night market activity came gradually as dawn approached. As the supply carts completed their deliveries and began heading back to warehouses or out of the city, as the night workers finished their shifts and headed home, as the early morning workers began appearing on the streets. The character of the city changed once again. By sunrise, most of the night markets had closed or transformed into different kinds of establishments. The taverns that had hosted raucous entertainment became quiet spaces serving breakfast too. Early workers, the vendors who had sold late-night snacks, packed up their goods and went home to sleep during the day. The transition from night to day Rome was like watching one city dissolve and another emerge from the same streets. The people who had filled the darkness disappeared into doorways, back rooms, and sleeping quarters that most daytime Romans never saw. The respectable citizens began emerging for another day of official business, proper commerce, and socially acceptable activities. But for those few hours of darkness, Rome had been something different. It had been a place where the empire's diversity, complexity, and humanity revealed itself more clearly than in any forum speech or official proclamation. The night markets weren't just about commerce or entertainment. They were about the fundamental human need to connect, to trade, to celebrate, and to find meaning in community, even when that community operated in the shadows of respectability. As I watched the last night vendors pack up their goods and the first morning shoppers begin to appear, I realized that I had witnessed something essential about how Rome actually worked. The official empire of laws, legions, and grand architecture was impressive, but it was built on the foundation of countless informal relationships, unofficial economies, and human connections that flourished in darkness and made everything else possible. The night markets revealed Rome's secret. It wasn't really ruled by emperors or senators or laws. It was held together by the millions of small human transactions, negotiations, and accommodations that happened every day, but which were most visible in the honest darkness when people dropped their daytime masks and dealt with each other as human beings who shared the same needs, fears, and hopes for survival in an impossible, magnificent, chaotic city. The hours between midnight and dawn in Rome belonged to a different world entirely, one that most Romans never saw and preferred not to think about. But I was always drawn to the spaces between things, the moments when one reality gave way to another. So I spent many nights walking through a Rome that was both asleep and strangely, quietly alive. This was when Rome revealed its most human face, stripped of the grand imperial pretensions and reduced to the basic rhythms of survival, rest, and the small, intimate moments that actually make life worth living. In the darkness, with most of the city's 2 million people asleep, you could finally hear Rome breathing. The soundscape of night was completely different from day. Gone were the constant voices of merchants, the clatter of business, the organized chaos of urban commerce. Instead, you heard the subtle sounds that daytime noise had masked. Water flowing through the aqueducts became audible as a gentle, constant whisper. The wind moving through empty streets created soft echoes between buildings. Distant sounds carried farther and seemed more mysterious. Animals that stayed hidden during the busy day emerged in the quiet hours. Cats, both domestic and feral, prowled the streets with the confident air of creatures who knew this was their time. Rats and mice scurried about their own urgent business. Birds that roost in the city's countless nooks and crannies stirred occasionally, adding soft rustles to the night's symphony. But even in the deepest hours of night, Rome was never completely still. The city's essential functions continued with skeleton crews of workers who kept the empire running while everyone else slept. The aqueduct system required constant monitoring and maintenance. The public fountains needed to flow continuously. The sewer system, Rome's other great engineering achievement, required attention from crews who worked in conditions that would challenge modern sanitation workers. I often walked with these night maintenance crews, and they were a breed apart from daytime Romans. They knew the city's hidden infrastructure, its secret passages, its underground networks of pipes, tunnels, and chambers that most citizens never suspected existed. They moved through Rome like fish through water, navigating by landmarks invisible to daytime eyes. These workers had their own culture, their own stories, their own ways of understanding the city. They kept functioning. They knew which neighborhoods generated the most problems, which systems were most likely to fail, which citizens were most appreciative of their work, and which treated them as invisible. They were Romans, but they lived in a parallel Rome that operated according to different rhythms and different rules. The Night Watch, Rome's security force, conducted their patrols with a mixture of vigilance and resignation. Crime did happen in the quiet hours, but it was different from daytime. Problems. Night crimes were often more desperate, more personal, more driven by immediate needs rather than elaborate schemes. The watchmen who dealt with these situations developed a practical philosophy about human nature that was both cynical and surprisingly compassionate. I walked patrol routes with watchmen who had learned to distinguish between different kinds of trouble before it escalated. They knew the difference between someone who was drunk and harmless versus drunk and dangerous. They could identify domestic disputes that required intervention versus family arguments that needed to be left alone. They understood which areas of the city attracted problems and which remained peaceful through their own social dynamics. But the Night Watch also dealt with situations that revealed Rome's more tender side. They assisted with difficult births when midwives needed help. They responded to medical emergencies in neighborhoods where no doctors lived. They helped elderly citizens who had become confused or lost in the darkness. They reunited children who had wandered away from home with worried families. The religious life of nighttime Rome was particularly fascinating. Many Roman religious observances happened during daylight hours, but some spiritual practices were specifically designed for darkness. Mystery religions, which promised to initiate special knowledge about life, death, and the nature of reality, often conducted their most important ceremonies at night. I attended gatherings of Mithras worshippers in underground chambers where candlelight flickered on walls decorated with cosmic imagery. These weren't public ceremonies, but intimate gatherings of men who had formed strong bonds through shared spiritual experiences. The darkness enhanced the sense of mystery and connection that drew them together. Similarly, followers of Isis, the Egyptian goddess who had become popular throughout the empire, held nighttime vigils that combined religious devotion with community support. These gatherings served both spiritual and practical purposes, providing comfort to people facing illness, financial problems, or personal crises that seemed more manageable when shared with others who understood. The quiet hours were also when Rome's domestic life became most visible. During the day, family activities were often overshadowed by public responsibilities, work obligations, and social duties. But at night, in the privacy of their homes, Romans revealed themselves as parents, spouses, and individuals with personal hopes and fears that had nothing to do with empire or politics. I observed the intimate rhythms of Roman family life through windows and open doorways that revealed glimpses of private moments. Parents checking on sleeping children, adjusting blankets against the cold, or simply watching their sons and daughters breathe with the deep contentment of people who had successfully guided their offspring through another day in a dangerous world. Married couples had conversations in the darkness that would have been impossible during the busy day. They discussed their worries about money, their hopes for their children's futures, their concerns about aging parents, and their dreams for better times ahead. These quiet conversations, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of Roman households, were the real foundation of the empire's stability. The economics of nighttime Rome were minimal but important. Some essential services had to operate continuously. Bakers began their work in the darkest hours, preparing bread that would be ready when the city woke. Night soilmen, who emptied chamber pots and latrines, conducted their unglamorous but essential work while most people slept and couldn't be offended by the smells and sounds of waste management. Medical emergencies didn't wait for daylight. So Rome maintained networks of doctors, midwives, and healers who could be summoned at any hour. These practitioners developed special skills for working in darkness, relying on touch, sound, and experience to diagnose and treat conditions that would be easier to handle in good light. The night also revealed Rome's vulnerabilities in ways that daylight disguised. Fire was always a concern, but it was more dangerous at night when fewer people were awake to notice and respond quickly. The wooden construction and closely packed buildings that characterized much of Rome meant that a single carelessly tended oil lamp could destroy entire neighborhoods before effective response was possible. I witnessed several nighttime fires during my time in Rome, and they revealed both the city's weaknesses and its surprising strengths. Romans had developed informal networks for fire response that activated automatically when someone spotted flames. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other during the day would work together frantically to form bucket chains, evacuate buildings, and contain damage. These emergency responses created temporary communities that crossed all social boundaries. Senators and slaves worked side by side to save buildings and lives. Wealthy matrons and poor washerwomen shared the same desperate energy when fire threatened their neighborhoods. The crisis stripped away social pretensions and revealed the fundamental human connections that held Roman society together. The weather affected nighttime Rome dramatically. Summer nights were often the most pleasant part of the day, encouraging people to stay outdoors later and socialize in ways that hot afternoons made uncomfortable. Romans would gather in courtyards, on rooftops, and in small parks to enjoy cooler air and conversation that felt more relaxed than formal daytime interactions. Winter nights were harsh tests of Roman engineering and social organization. The hypocaust heating systems that warmed public buildings were expensive to operate and not available in most private homes. Ordinary Romans faced long, cold nights with minimal heat, relying on shared body warmth, heavy clothing, and small charcoal braziers that provided comfort at the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning. I spent winter nights in Roman homes and marveled at the ingenuity people developed for staying warm. Families would heat stones by their fires during the evening, then wrap them in cloth and take them to bed as personal heaters. They would wear multiple layers of clothing to sleep, creating cocoons of wool and linen that trapped body heat. They would share beds not just for intimacy, but for survival, using collective warmth to get through the coldest hours. The rhythm of Roman sleep was different from modern patterns. Most Romans went to bed shortly after sunset and woke before dawn, but they often experienced what historians call segmented sleep. They would sleep for several hours, wake in the middle of the night for an hour or two of quiet activities, then return to sleep until morning. During these middle-of-the-night wake periods, Romans would tend fires, check on family members, use chamber pots, eat small snacks, or simply lie quietly and think about their lives. Some used these hours for prayer or meditation, others for intimate conversations with spouses, still others for planning the next day's activities or reflecting on the day just past. This sleep pattern created a unique atmosphere during the deepest night hours. The city wasn't completely asleep, but it also wasn't fully awake. There was a dreamy, contemplative quality to Rome between midnight and dawn that was unlike any other time. People moved more slowly, spoke more quietly, and seemed more thoughtful about their actions and words. Children's sleep patterns were particularly interesting to observe. Roman children often slept with their parents or siblings, both for warmth and for security. But they also seemed to wake more easily than adults, perhaps because their smaller bodies were more sensitive to temperature changes or because they were naturally more alert to potential dangers. I watched Roman parents comforting children who had been awakened by nightmares, strange noises, or simply the discomfort of being cold. These intimate moments revealed the tender side of Roman family life that formal histories rarely capture. Fathers who were stern disciplinarians during the day became gentle comforters in the darkness. Mothers who spent their days managing household logistics became soft voices offering reassurance and protection. The quiet hours also belonged to Rome's invisible populations in special ways. Slaves who worked long days serving others often found their only personal time in the darkness before dawn or after their masters had gone to sleep. These stolen hours were precious opportunities for slaves to maintain their own relationships, practice their own cultural traditions, or simply exist as individuals rather than as labor. Some slaves used the quiet hours to learn skills that might eventually help them earn freedom. Others maintained connections with family members who had been sold to different households. Still others simply sat quietly and remembered homes and lives that seemed impossibly distant from their current circumstances. The religious observances of nighttime were often more personal and emotional than daytime ceremonies. People facing illness, loss, or major life transitions would make private offerings to household gods or visit neighborhood shrines when fewer people were around to observe their vulnerability. These quiet spiritual moments were when Romans revealed their deepest fears and hopes to whatever gods they trusted with their most important prayers. Elderly Romans often became more active during the quiet hours, perhaps because age had changed their sleep patterns, or because they found peace in the gentler pace of nighttime. I observed old men and women who spent the middle hours of the night in activities that gave their lives meaning: tending small gardens, maintaining household shrines, preparing special foods, or simply sitting quietly and remembering their long lives. As dawn approached, the quiet hours gradually gave way to the stirrings of another day. The bakers who had been working through the darkness were nearly ready to serve their first customers. The night maintenance crews were finishing their tasks and preparing to hand the city over to day workers. The night watch was looking forward to the end of their shifts and the safety of daylight. But for those few hours before sunrise, Rome existed in a state of vulnerability and intimacy that revealed something essential about human nature. Stripped of daytime pretensions, reduced to basic needs for warmth, safety, rest, and connection, Romans showed themselves to be remarkably similar to people from any era. They worried about their families, they struggled with loneliness, they sought comfort in familiar rituals, and they hoped for better tomorrows. The quiet hours reminded me that behind all the grand architecture, military conquests, and political dramas that filled the history books, Rome was fundamentally a collection of individual human lives trying to find meaning, security, and happiness in a complex and often dangerous world. The empire's true strength wasn't its legions or its laws, but its ability to provide a framework within which millions of people could pursue their personal hopes and dreams while contributing to something larger than themselves. As the sun began to rise and Rome prepared for another day of imperial business, the quiet hours faded like a dream that left traces of wisdom but couldn't be fully captured or explained. The city would soon be loud again, busy again, full of the grand gestures and important activities that made Rome seem eternal and invincible. But I had seen Rome's secret heart in those quiet hours, and I knew that the empire's real foundation was built not of marble and bronze, but of countless small moments of human kindness, courage, and connection that happened mostly in darkness, mostly in private, and mostly without anyone recognizing their true importance to the functioning of civilization. I'm the historian. I have seen much, and I will see more. Perhaps, one day, I shall tell you again what I learned walking through Rome, from the morning crowds to the quiet hours, was that empires aren't built by emperors or senators or grand proclamations. They're built by bakers who wake at 3 a.m. to feed their neighbors, by strangers who share bath water and gossip, by night workers who keep the city running while everyone sleeps, and by families who comfort each other in darkness. Rome fell as all things must. The aqueducts cracked, the forums emptied, the great buildings crumbled into ruins that tourists photograph today. But what I remember most isn't the marble or the monuments. It's the sound of 2 million people somehow learning to live together. The smell of bread baking in countless small ovens, and the quiet conversations that happen between heartbeats, in the spaces where history is really made. The empire was magnificent, but the people were more magnificent still.